Well, I'm here with Minni Jain, who's with the Flow Partnership and Waterways World Water School, and an organization that does a lot of water projects. So cool. I'm really glad to have you on, Minni.
Thank you, Alpha. Thank you for having me on your show, on your podcast.
Cool. Do you want to share a little bit about how you got into water?
Yes, we could do that. It's not. I guess I started really actively working in water in somewhere around 2011. But prior to that, we had already set up the charity, and there had been we'd set up a charity in India, and then we started looking at the different aspects of the climate and environment, and all those aspects that lead to a good, healthy life. And we'd set up the charity around that in the UK. Water was, we knew, a really integral part of it, and we knew that is the biggest. So in a sense, we did a few of the other projects first, like local seasonal organic food, looking at the spirit, looking at science, looking at how good, healthy air, what we need. And then we arrived at water. So that was somewhere around in 2011. And roughly around that time, when I started making a foray into looking at what is really happening in the space around water and what the water cycle, I was invited to speak at a project in Portugal called Tamera. And they also asked me at the same time if there was anybody I could suggest if I would like to invite. So at that point, I had never met Rajendra Singh, and I really wanted to meet him, knowing what fantastic work they were doing in India. And so I said, can we invite Rajendra Singh? And here's the contact. And if you went and invited him, maybe he'll come. And he did accept the invitation, and he came. And literally, it was a very fortuitous and very, very wonderful meeting between Rajendra and me. And we got on like that from that very second. And that's when he invited me to India to see. I live in the UK, and he invited me to India to see really the kind of work he had been doing for the last 35 years. And I have a lovely story of that time when he said, look, how many people do you think I should invite when you're there? So I said, well, if we want to have a discussion, maybe 3 or 4 really, people who you think would add value to the discussion. He said, fine. And when I arrived there were about 29 people. It was a wonderful week. And really seeing the kind of work Rajendra and his villagers had been doing in arid and dry Rajasthan over the last 30 years, I knew then and there itself that this is going to be a lifetime's work, a commitment for life. And that really we have to go very, very deep into this space of community regeneration of landscapes, and not just in India but globally. So that's when around that time came back and set up the Flow Partnership. Rajendra was very keen that we look at it internationally. So together, myself and Philip, my colleague, and Rajendra, and we really started looking at how we can look at this community regeneration of landscapes, looking at their water as an international endeavor. So that's a long answer to your question.
Okay, cool. And so you started in Britain, but you're looking at the projects in India. Is this water situation similar in Britain and India?
Well, this year it almost is similar, because this was the first year that Britain declared that there was a drought in the country. So you could almost say that it is similar. However, when we started, the thing that we looked at is building interventions in the landscape that hold the rainwater. So you can call it rainwater harvesting, you can call it water retention, you can call it holding water, whatever the term that suits you, but it is essentially holding the water in the landscape and not letting it run off. And those structures or interventions, which are like little check dams or little walls or swales or ditches or a pond or whatever the structure is suited to that particular geographical landscape, it doesn't let the water run away. but that fulfills two purposes. No? So in a drought area, the water goes into the ground and recharges the underground aquifer and raises the water level in the wells, and any surplus going to create seasonal or even perennial streams. But it's the same thing happens in a flood. So floods and droughts are two sides of the same coin. So those same structures which hold the water stop it from becoming, in a flood scenario, from becoming this huge volume of water rushing downstream and flooding the villages and towns downstream. So that realization was very, very crucial to understand that that is how nature works, and that is how you're looking at floods and droughts, but actually you go even beyond that. You're looking at the management of water, or how water flows and what water does in the landscape. And so floods and droughts are effects of bad management of water, I'd say, or not managing water properly in the landscape if you have a settlement. But if you looked after your landscape and held it at the right points, you'd go a long way to resolving both droughts and floods with the same kind of interventions and structures.
So when you started off in Britain, was it dealing with more droughts or more floods, the initial situation?
No, so sorry, I didn't complete that answer to that first question. So when we started in Britain, when we set it up in Britain, we were looking at expanding the kind of work that Rajendra was doing, expanding it globally, and also making, nobody knew of that work. So making that awareness, creating awareness around those structures and what was happening with the drought and those interventions, and what the villagers were doing in India for droughts. And then somewhere around that time, I saw this program on an environmental program on the BBC, which was featuring similar kinds of things: woody debris, leaky dams, small little check dam type of things being built in this country, and they were stopping floods. And that was a revelatory moment for me. So the people who were doing, the scientists who were doing it, there was an iconic project in the north of England, which was called Belford, and which had been done by our colleagues Paul Quinn and Mark Wilkinson and their team. And so we didn't know them at that time. We contacted them and very hesitantly told them that what you are doing to manage floods, those same things that you're putting in the landscape, in the flow pathway of the water, we're doing in India to manage droughts. And they were thrilled, because they also knew, they were scientists, but they were people who were working on the ground with the farmers, and actually seeing what happens when you manage water in the right way. And it didn't matter whether they were doing floods. It's that management of the flow of water is what they were looking at. So they invited us up to the James Hutton Institute up in Scotland and said, why don't you give us a presentation? And so we went up, and there were about 40 scientists in the room, all flood specialists. And here I am, not a scientist, and we were going to talk about what we were doing in India about droughts. And it was a wonderful conversation. It was immediately a meeting of understanding that in this country, we may be looking at floods. In the UK, it rains a lot. So you are looking at different interventions that manage floods, that communities can do, that small structures that you can use to manage floods. And we were talking about those same kinds of structures our communities in India were building to manage droughts. So that discussion was really, powerful, in that it became a whole understanding of water. So you had the understanding of floods, which is what UK grapples with, and you had the understanding of droughts, which India grapples with, and bringing them together, that understanding that actually communities can work with them and deal with those problems in a similar sort of a way together. So while we worked with our colleagues a lot on flooding and natural management flooding in the UK, this year it's been very interesting that a lot of people have been talking to us about our work in India and saying that we can do that here, and some of our responses, actually you're already doing that here. So in a way, how do you bring the attention to the fact that floods and droughts are two sides of the same coin, and you're already managing that. So it doesn't matter whether you're working with floods or you're working with droughts. In the whole perspective, but of course locally you deal with the problem that is more prevalent.
Well, it's interesting that the solutions to droughts and floods are the same. And you could also argue that there's also a drought flood cycle, that the causation, they're actually influencing each other, because the droughts can sometimes create fires, which then takes away the vegetation, which slows down floods, and it sometimes puts a waxy surface on the soil, which the water doesn't absorb. And so then you have these floods. Well, when there are big rains, the floods will come. And then the floods wash away the topsoil, which makes the droughts a lot worse, because then you're not absorbing the rainfall. And so there's this kind of drought flood cycle that's causative too. So
absolutely, one leads to the other. It's like it's exactly that. If the topsoil goes away, then you've actually created conditions for a drought and a flood. So if you cut trees, you've created same conditions. There is nothing in the landscape to hold the water as it's rushing down. And again, there is nothing in the landscape to hold the water to make the landscape water rich and stop it from drying out. So it is two sides of the same coin. It's the problem that you're grappling with in that particular area. You'll find that if you look at it in a whole context, you'll realize that it is that cycle that you're talking about. So you look after one, and you will look after the other. But if you do too much of one or too little of the other, then you will have that cycle perpetuating itself. And eventually it becomes a drought. Because eventually once vegetation goes and there is nothing there to for rain to for the cycle, water cycle to be functioning, eventually you will get a complete breakdown of the cycle, and finally drought is what occurs. There's nothing there in the landscape to sustain the water, to hold the water.
yeah, because when there's soil to absorb the rainfall, that water can then evapotranspire and go further inland and create more rain in the small water cycle, or what's called moisture recycling.
Absolutely. It's that healthy small water cycle is what we are looking to create, that optimum balance of moisture in the landscape, no? So when that balance shifts, you get the flood or you get the drought, and then that, of course, feeds into the large water cycle and the heat islands and the hurricanes and all that we get.
What is your sense when you've been talking to different scientists and hydrologists? Do they understand that the solutions to droughts and floods are the same, and do they realize that droughts and floods are causing each other?
So, I mean, if you talk, scientists, of course, don't like to categorically say something like that. They like their evidence, and they don't like to state it as a fact because they don't know how the climate will behave. So that's one thing. But there are also scientists and there are scientists. There are scientists who are so married to the evidence and the numbers that they crunch that they find it very difficult to really go beyond into understanding what communities are actually doing. But then there are scientists who are now more and more increasing, the tribe is increasing, who are working with nature-based solutions, and they definitely do understand. It's not rocket science. I'm not a scientist. It's easy enough to understand. You sit with communities, you see what they do, whether it's in a very educated country like countries that you find in the Western world, or countries like India where there is a lot of farming population which hasn't had that kind of school education, but they have a different kind of education. So you have scientists of two various kinds, but I think that understanding is becoming very, very clear. That it isn't just numbers. When you look at it in reality and how it translates into the landscape, then that understanding there's no gap there. So slowly, I think that crunching numbers, but it has to be in service of the landscape and community and understanding that water cycle. I think a lot of scientists are beginning to talk about it. They understand it, but they're now beginning to talk about it a lot more.
And which fields are these scientists usually in? Is it hydrology or is it climate scientists, or who are these people working with this?
I mean, it's a very general statement I'll make, but the ones that we normally meet are often hydrologists, so they do understand how water flows, so it's not a problem. But then you have climate scientists as well, and then you have geographers, and you have so those are the general kinds that we meet. In general, we work more with communities and lesser with scientists. If I don't get into a scientific debate, because then I would need that kind of foundation to speak with them. My foundation is community and what community does. But there are, when you're invited to certain forums where there are very top-notch scientists over there, you often find that because now this has become mainstream, climate change is no longer to be denied, even though you might have a few deniers, that the kind of fires and droughts and floods that we're seeing in the last 2-3 years, and especially this year, there is a lot of understanding and concern about this. So I think even those very hard number crunching scientists are having to look at the water cycle very seriously.
It seems the mass media, the story that reaches the mass media is that floods and droughts are caused by greenhouse gases. Like greenhouse gases heat up, and then that heating of the climate then causes droughts and floods. But I haven't heard as much that it's because the land use, and we're disrupting the small water cycle, that's the reason that we're getting these droughts and floods. I think that story reaches a little less the media.
I think you're right there, Alpha, because that whole, first of all, mass media itself is their least, they for them, news is what is the news that sells. So often they themselves don't know very much, and the news that goes out from social media almost, or channels like yours or podcasts which are really focusing on these kind of problems, if people get their information or knowledge or news from these kind of places, then that's likely to be far more reliable. What makes it to the mainstream media is often it's often an occurrence, an event, and around that event you'll get a few pundits giving their take, and but you don't get that kind of reasoned discussion quite often, and so often some of that stuff is actually paid for by organizations that have vested interests in denying some certain things, or greenhouse gases, for example. It's linked to so many things. So it's mainstream media is really just the starting point to get your news, but to really get something serious, to understand something seriously, you have to go beyond that.
So your group has done work in education, trying to educate people about all these things. So do you want to talk a little bit about your efforts to educate people about these new water stories or old water stories?
Okay, so the waterways.world is what we started as an online water school, and there are various offshoots of that coming in different continents, depending on what the communities locally want and need. It's a different school. It's not a school where you can come in and you can do a course and you can go away with a certain body of knowledge or a degree or whatever it is that online schools do. We set it up with knowing, when we'd worked with different communities across, this started especially with India, but also looking at Europe. We worked with communities in Europe. And we found that one of the biggest gaps is for communities who are unable to do work on the ground, is that there is no space for communities to share successful learning with each other in the space of water. And some of the communities we work with are amongst the poorest communities on the planet. I mean, there's no question that they'll have space to share. And so that's a real gap. So if you have a community in the back of beyond in Rajasthan that is actually reviving their landscape using a traditional method, building what they call johads in Rajasthan, and actually alleviating those conditions of drought, it's hugely successful. And yet it doesn't make it to the community 3 valleys down. Why not? or because three valleys down could also be that they're also suffering from drought, and they would really benefit from knowing what the other community has done, no? And that gap needed to be addressed. So rather than having a school where people can, scroll the net, find what they want, and they're in this space now, there are many, many organizations who are offering really wonderful courses in terms of understanding the water cycle, understanding the flow of water, what to do. So we decided that was not the space we wanted to enter. We wanted to enter that space of making available successful methods that communities can share with each other. So we've got, one is an online platform where if there is a particularly successful community that has done water retention and really revitalized their area and landscape together as a community, and it's a space for them to present their work, and those who come for them to ask questions, learn the method back and forth. So it's that kind of space for communities to sit together and learn from each other. So that's one part of it. And then the other, we are slowly building this up, but you really need funds and you need visionaries to really support this kind of work, where you have method, you can make short films of the actual methods. So, and if those methods can be presented in a way that any community can understand, if you know your landscape, how to build a little johad in the landscape, for example, or a little pond, or a little staggered ditch, what are the things you need to look out for? So that kind of, and that works very well with animation as well. Real life story coupled with animation. So we did one of that as a project with an engineering firm called Arup, and it was called Water Up Skilling. So we created a film around a johad like that and tested that out with a community in completely the other side of the world in Colombia. So done in Rajasthan, tested with a community in Colombia who not only got it, who completely understood what the whole thing was as the film went, because they had something similar happening in their community in terms of holding water.
Could you
And
explain
yet
what a
they
johad
learned
is?
something more.
I think some of the listeners might not know what a johad is. Do you want to just explain what that is?
Okay, a johad is like a small check dam. It's an intervention that you build in the landscape, especially along the flow pathway of water coming down small hill slopes. And if you build it in the right place where the maximum water pools, if you build that little check dam, and they don't have to be very concrete check dams. They can just be very small, made of mud, dug from the where the water will be held. And they used to be built, and so when the water falls, that johad stops the water from running downstream. It holds the water behind the johad. So, or the check dam, you can also call it a check dam. And those are traditional structures built in Rajasthan, because Rajasthan in India is very dry and very desertified. And traditionally, they had to hold the water when the water fell during the months of the monsoon. If they didn't do that, then they had a whole year of dry period ahead of them. So that's how they used to hold the water for their daily use. So those johads we found are basically interventions in the landscape, just holding the water. So you can call them johads in Rajasthan. You can call them haves in Colombia. You can call them different names in different cultures. Essentially, their function is to hold the water as it falls from the sky.
And then when you're teaching the community, you're teaching a lot of people to learn how to build these johads, or you just select a couple of people to learn how to do it and then they do it for the community, or how does it usually work?
It's so to roll back a little bit. The work we do, or we enable or facilitate, is community-driven decentralized water management. So if you unpack each of those words, community, so the community is the crucial part of it. Driven, that means it's driven by the community, it's done by the community, it's desired by the community. Decentralized, which means it's not in our control, it is in their control. Water management. So this is water management done by the community with processes and methods that they know. We don't teach them anything. On the contrary, they usually, in general, especially in areas like Rajasthan, which traditionally have very dry climate, there are traditional methods and means that their ancestors used to be able to hold the water. Now, there are two aspects to that. One is those traditional methods like johads were going out of fashion. As the older generation was dying out, that knowledge was going with them. So in the revival of that, there is a traditional method come back, which is actually very relevant. But then there is the other side of it. We live in 2022. So you can't sit and say the past is all there is. There is a huge body of science which has uncovered amazing wisdom and knowledge as well, which would be very useful to communities on the ground. But how do you make that available to communities that don't necessarily read and write or the same language? So a lot of our work is in facilitating that interaction or understanding of what communities need to know on both sides. So one is what they already know about water management, traditional. Two is what potentially could help them from the other communities or the scientific body, or what people in other countries, scientists in other countries have uncovered, which might be useful, or interpretation of satellite data, and as well as bringing back to the educated community what kind of questions communities grapple with. So there is an interchange. It's an exchange. It's not a top down. So the learning that happens is actually an exchange between communities. So we don't have courses that we teach them. We create the learning materials. We create the learning space for communities to come into, and we make that available for them to learn from each other. So the next step of that, of course, is learning visits, exchange visits between communities, and we're slowly working on that. So the online bit is a genuine exchange between communities. That's why it's not a course-driven teaching space. Nobody teaches each other except the communities that interact with each other. It's very
so you kind of go into a community, you say, let's create a space of dialogue, and then you invite also communities from another place to kind of come in and share with that community. That's kind of the process.
That is one step. Yes, that's one way of doing it. And or there's if there is an NGO that's been working on a particular method in that area. So let's say Rajendra and his organization have been working on johads. So then you organize, other communities, other farmers from the region, from across further, who want to come and learn that method in the real. So it's a kind of a water school which works with the interaction between communities of one area who are doing it successfully with communities who want to do the same thing in their area, who feel that might be of benefit. So it's a community exchange knowledge portal.
And how many communities? How many communities approximately have you worked with in India?
It's hard to keep track, but I know that Rajendra's lot, they have a huge number of farmers coming from all over India, and it can at any. I would say that they could even have. I know the figure 4,000 was said to me at one point, which was over a period of 6 months. So it depends, really. It can be thousands of people, depending on if they're having a huge sort of learning event. So you can have many, many, many. And Rajendra himself is very active in terms of creating awareness around this kind of way of managing water in the landscape. The online forum that we run, we have been doing that in Africa now for the last 1 year. And I would say we try and do one session about, depending on finding the right community. We've done about one session in every 6 weeks or so. So we've done about 6 sessions, 6 to 7 sessions. And about 700 to 800 people from who are farmers and villagers and land managers in rural communities have come to those sessions. So I would say that, yeah, it's about those. And that kind of level at the moment.
And that session is a day long, or it's multi-week?
Oh no, it's a 2 hour session. But
Okay.
within the 2 hour session, there is a there is a presentation of what the community has done, what is the method they've used, how they did it and how they do it. And then there is a larger space for question and answers and discussions, and then a space for them to connect with each other at the end. So it's not, moderated. It's moderated by us, but it's not held as in going through us. They are very free to contact each other, and that has created quite a lot of buzz actually, because people do visit each other on the ground in different parts, some of the different countries that we've been working, having presentations from.
And is this the same method that works in Britain, or you have to do it differently in Britain to get things to happen?
So in Britain, we are doing it slightly differently in that we are not ourselves doing any work, but we are working with colleagues who are doing that kind of work. So Britain is slightly different, but at the same time, the methods that our colleagues are coming up with, leaky dams, etc., and living willow barriers and all that, the method can be the same. It's just in fact it depends on a really good internet connection, and it depends on interest. So and that is the same for across the world. If you have a really good internet connection, if people have a really good internet connection and there is material available, people join in. The world is far more digital than we know. One of the biggest drivers for setting up the water school like this, Alpha, was there was this very interesting article I'd read about 8 years ago in the Harvard Business Review, one of those very, well-regarded magazines, about how rural parts of the world now have, in various countries, but especially countries like India, have fantastic internet and internet speeds. And that even if the older generation is not really internet savvy, but the next generation and the younger generation definitely is. So this is planning for the future. It isn't just the way things happen, but methods, knowledge, exchange, discussion in the rural areas, even in poor communities, goes from the internet, through the mobile phones, okay, through WhatsApp is hugely used in Africa. You have a small 5-minute film, it can get viral in seconds in the backyards of different countries in Africa. So that's that thinking that it has to be located in one place. We had to think, what is the scenario going to be in the future? So that digital, you'd be really surprised. People don't know how to read and write, but a mobile phone, definitely, and WhatsApp, a video on it, if they can't read it, their granddaughter or their grandson is showing it to them, and then they pass it on to each other. So learning is happening in variously interesting ways with the arrival of the internet and technologies like mobile phones.
So we need to kind of create these viral videos on like how to build a johad or something on TikTok and
yes,
Instagram
absolutely.
and
That's what
YouTube.
Totally. If you have something successful that really works for a community, create a video around that and put it out there. And if it's really well done, if it speaks to people, it gets picked up and it gets shared. The problem is universal. We are now in England as well, you're facing drought. So there are communities asking, what shall we do? What shall we do? It's just so simple. So it's not, of course, it's not as simple as just seeing a video and creating a johad. But that's the starting point, to use your brain to think, right, this is my community, this is where I'm living, I've just seen another community that's done something like that. This is something I can do over here. And then you take the next step. So in rural communities, it's the local NGO, which could be connected, if they don't have a local NGO, somebody somewhere knows. And in countries like the UK, you go on the net and you find the local scientist or the local environment agency person who's done something like this, and it carries on from there. So
Yeah, so in some ways, if we can create some kind of viral social media campaign, like maybe about the drought flood cycle, and then also solutions to the droughts and the floods, or like hashtag Johad against droughts or something, hashtag
yeah.
Johads against floods, like, or and kind of create maybe hashtag movement, or like this, there must be some way to kind of really accelerate this whole digital platform to kind of activate
Totally. I
water.
mean, that is the way to do it. I find that, we can have, there are traditional ways of talking about it, and you have the traditional schools and you have the traditional conferences and summits, etc., which are great meeting places for people to actually hear from each other, etc. But you have to have this in the parallel. What is technology for if it's not used in the right way? It's not just to exchange, social interaction. It's also this, use it. And this is what's going to come tomorrow. This is the technology of the future. It'll be even smarter than we have it today. But if we put in place these kind of hashtag Johads and all those things here now in place, then we've already created the foundation for it.
Yeah, and maybe activate some of these teenagers and people in their 20s who are very good at creating these viral videos, and get a whole bunch of them and see if they can seed this into the, yeah. And, like you have these viral dances and you have the viral ALLS, ice bucket challenge. Like there could be some viral thing, build a swale, and then get your other neighborhood to build a swale or something to catch the rainwater, something like that.
The only thing you have to be very careful about is that if it becomes viral in a fashion and they don't really think it through, then you can do damage as well.
Right.
So there is a scientific basis to where you construct a johad. You don't just build a johad anywhere. The villagers know where to build the johad in the landscape. So, we can create a viral movement, but it has to go alongside with seriously looking at doing it right.
Do you want to say a little bit about where you put the johads in villages?
It really depends on where you are. So, do you have hills? Do you not have hills? If you don't have hills and you don't actually do johads, you could do a chalk system. It depends. So, therefore, the method is dependent on the geography of the area. But for johads itself, if you go halfway up the hills, that's upstream is where you build the johads. So you hold the water upstream. That's a universal principle in any case. No, you hold the water upstream, and then it stops it from becoming this flood downstream, and it recharges the aquifer right from on top, so that it recharges the wells downstream in drier areas. But you don't site the johad any old where. The villagers who live in that area will know where the flow pathways of the water is, where the maximum water collects. So you site the johad there. You don't site it where half the water will come and half of it will go. You site it in that place in upstream where putting that intervention will hold the maximum water coming down. No? So those kind of things are definitely, they have to be kept in mind, or you could then build it in the wrong place. And if you build it in the wrong place and it doesn't do the job, then there is always the thing, oh God, what a waste of time, what a waste of money, what a waste of XYZ. It doesn't work. It does work. But you have to do it with, knowing the landscape of where you live. So that's why it's a community effort, Alpha. It has to be the community wants to do it. The community comes together to do it. You won't get 100% of the people 100% of the time, but in general, 80 to 90% of the community has to agree that's what they're doing. And when they then do it, then they are responsible for it. So then they do it very carefully. But if I come in and say, I'm going to build a johad for you, what a complete waste of time, because I'm not giving them any agency over their area, their knowledge, their wisdom, their, the responsibility. It is their area. They live in it. They're the ones in trouble. They are the ones who want to create that abundance in their area. And if they do it with themselves, it's far more exciting than some NGO coming in and doing it. But often when it's a really poor area, or when it is an area where people haven't had the chance to really understand water flows like this, or like here, then the larger part of that work The larger time is spent in the dialogues and discussions with the community. No? And that's when the community comes on board. And then after that, getting them to do it in the knowing the right place, building the right structure, maybe it's not a johad, whatever it is, or maybe it's a sand dam, depending on what they've uncovered. It's a whole process. And that process comes alive when the community takes the responsibility for it.
So,
And the really crucial point in this, after this, is you and I are two individuals. How much can we do physically, in terms of facility, doing it for somebody? But if you have this kind of movement, it's a people's movement. And if you have this kind of movement, which then goes viral, then you have many more people doing it, just way beyond you. And that's what's needed in the world today.
So in the US, we have, know quite a few people in different communities. They're interested in doing, in America, we call them swales, or at least in permaculture and check dams, and doing this kind of work. But how do you have some advice on the next steps they can take to activate their community to undertake some of these actions?
Well, the first is you talk to everyone in your community, not just the people you like. So that's the first step, because everybody in your community has to come together, has to understand what is the idea you're proposing. And those discussions aren't easy, but those discussions are your foundation. Once you have people in your community really understanding that this idea that you're bringing of permaculture or building swales is going to do this, if you've had those discussions and conversations, and that's the hard work. That is the legwork that's required for anybody wanting to do something in their community. If you're doing it on your land, you don't need to really talk with anybody unless you're really wanting to talk about it. So that's the one thing I would say, is that do that legwork. Bring
Basically,
your
maybe
community.
go around your neighborhood, put on an event, and then create a circle where everyone can kind of share a little bit. And then what's the issue in your area? Is it lack of groundwater? Is it too hot, too dry?
But the language is us. The language is not you. So if you have, let's say, 10 people coming together from a particular area, they are articulating what their problem is. You're sitting there facilitating it, maybe because you've come from outside, but if it's done by somebody within the area itself, so let's say you didn't have your permaculture farm that you're already on at the moment, but that was a place you were going to set up, or it was it was a whole community you were setting up, or you were siting it within an existing community. Then you make those social connections first, the discussions first, understand what's in the area. And that's the largest part of the work, the hardest part of the work. You have loads of people in every community, has those who know, those who don't want to know, those who will tell you how to do it and won't do anything apart from watching you, and be critical about it. There'll be those who will encourage you thoroughly. There will be those who will give you the, come and join you, and you want them all. You want that. So the hard work, the leg work, is actually having those conversations with all. And it can be one, it can be two, it can be 3 events, it can be 4 events. And then at a certain point, it moves into action. And that's why one person can't do it. You see, if you look at it, that's why it is a crowdsourced thing. It's a people's movement. Different people will do it for their communities. It's not driven by one organization or one person. It is driven by those who are facing that particular issue in their community. When it's driven by them, when it's driven by the community, then it becomes something that will happen. And then you resource them and make them strong with
I
what
really
can
think
happen.
that this water movement has to be a decentralized, community networked kind of process.
I agree. Absolutely. It has to be decentralized. It cannot be controlled by the water companies. It cannot be controlled by the water mafia. It cannot be controlled by even by very well-meaning NGOs. It should not be controlled. It is, if we all drink water, then we all have a responsibility to generate that water within the communities, or I mean, the larger communities, the earth, of course. So we have a responsibility towards it, and it has to be decentralized. You can't be told by so and so to do this. Wherever you are, you know the problem. And if there is an equality in the discussion, then the problem is likely to be resolved. But if there is, the problem comes in that when we don't have discussions like that. Somebody is telling you to do this, so it'll bring its own resultant pushbacks and pullbacks and whatever else have you. So it goes on.
Do you have any way, because I know a lot of people in their communities want to get this going. Do you have any sort of training, or like these people, if they want to spearhead in their own watershed activating, or do you have some seminars that people can go to, or?
And we don't do that, one, but it's actually, you don't need much training, Alpha. It's like, the question you're asking is that we need to learn how to talk to each other, no? And we need to learn how to listen to each other. And that's very hard. So one thing, of course, we do is say, again, I come back to the Rajasthan example because that's where the maximum work has been done, is you do have people, like in every community across the world, we've got a water problem, but you do it for us. Okay, that's the first response you get when you hold a community. And immediately you just think, I'm not doing it for you. How many can I do? It's your community, you're living here. Please, can you not see that you need to take the step? But you have to go beyond that. No? So you always need somebody who can hold that patience with which to have that conversation. So you have to have that patience. You have to have that patience to listen to what is being said and really being said, with a focus on what can happen. So we know the community in Rajasthan needs water. So the process is more towards getting them to admit they need the water, and they'll do it. The process is not telling them you can do this. The process is getting them to take responsibility, to go peel back the layers of, you don't take responsibility for them. It's, if you live in that community, then it's a shared responsibility. If you don't live in that community, but you're helping facilitate the conversation, then you have to facilitate the conversation to the point that they take the responsibility. Now, all that is much easier if there is actually a water problem. If there isn't, if it's a preemptive thing, then it's much harder. No? If you're having a drought, people will talk to you. If you have a flood, you're having a flood, people will talk to you. But if there is no flood or no drought, they'll say, yeah, but we're very busy doing this, that, the other, come another time. So then the number of people who are looking at it preemptively, looking at the trends, looking at what's been happening in the last 5 years in the climate, what were the problems the community faced, are fewer. But nevertheless, there is still a conversation there to be had, which then expands. So like here, I live in a village, and there is a sustainable Staverton group. So while Staverton, the village I live in, is very green, it's very lush, it's got a river flowing through it, people are fairly well off, there are lovely farms around. Nevertheless, you want them to look at climate change issues and what our lifestyles are doing. And I didn't set it up, it was already an existing group that's here. And they meet once a month just to keep a grip on the issues and alive. So there's no flooding issue here at the moment. But this year, it did look like they might have a drought issue. But nevertheless, there's the group. Sometimes they're treated seriously. Sometimes they're treated, that's that green group. But the conversation, and that's happening across. It happens in the US as well. Is what you're talking about, the group. That bit people don't get. We fall into that trap of giving of our knowledge, but you evoke that knowledge from within people, then it's much more powerful and much more long lasting.
So this year there were floods in Pakistan and Australia and in Florida. So after those floods, is that a time to kind of go into those neighborhoods and try to activate people, like to say you could do swales and johads in your community that might have, lessened
No,
the.
no, not in the aftermath of a flood like that is very devastating. So the communities are just simply grappling with getting their lives back to normal again. No, so like in Pakistan, for example, and those are huge scale floods. So when we're talking of swales, etc., we're talking of a small area. The floods that happened in Pakistan were huge. It needs a governmental program, to look at the whole region holistically. So once people's lives are getting back on track, that's when you start really the conversation so that it doesn't happen again. But you need the government in charge, involved. You need the government to also be concerned. So you have, if you look at the programs in India, you have programs set up by the government, which has a certain budget to create these kind of interventions, johads, etc., for every village. Mm. Uh, is there a take up from every village? No, but slowly, as the drought started growing, the take up started going more. So it's not in the immediate aftermath of a natural disaster. They don't have the mind to listen, space to listen. They don't know where their belongings are. They don't know, if you're talking of Pakistan, for example, no? But we have a conversation going on in Ireland, in a particular region where one particular river floods, and that floods every year. So there is a conversation every year after the flood. And slowly, there is the residents hopefully are making, in collaboration with the local NGO with whom we work, making the government fork out a bit of a budget so that that whole catchment, not even catchment level, just that little bit, they can do some, natural solutions to halt that flooding, and then go a little more and go a little more. So it's a slow process. It needs that committed group of individuals within the community. But
Yeah.
in a wealthier society, it's much easier to talk after a flood. But the scale of flood in Pakistan it's a different ball game.
Right. Yeah. I think in Pakistan, Australia, you can't just do just swales and johads. You actually need to set aside whole floodplains, I think, and
Yes.
allow those levees not to be on the rivers so that the whole
Yeah.
area can flood.
And you need disaster relief and all those, those are very poor communities. So you need a government, that government programs for that scale.
I know in Florida, there was one community that did actually have their own, I think they created a bit more wetlands and johads and all this stuff. And so it actually wasn't affected by the floods as much as all the surrounding communities. So that could be
It
held as an
works.
example,
It works. The project I was telling you about right at the start, the Belford one in northern England, that was a little village which had a little stream called a burn about 40 miles long, and it in 2 years it sort of would flood about 5 times, 4 or 5 times. And then, so over that 40-mile long, and the farmers, in England, there was the act which said which paid farmers to drain the land. So it's very hard for them to go back to holding the water on the land. They were paid to drain the land, and that's what the law was. So farmers to think, what are you saying? Hold the water on the land and it'll stop flooding. It didn't make sense to them. So when our colleagues went, as I said, they spent the first year was actually spent in constant conversation with the farmers and discussions and showing them, talking to them, and etc., etc. And then when some of the farmers agreed to allow them to put little interventions, and then on the stream they put the woody debris, etc. One of the farmers actually said, if that's going to stop flooding, I'll eat my hat. I'm sure he's eaten 20 hats since, because it's not flooded since. And that converts the farmers. And if one of those serious traditional farmers gets converted, there's your next step. Much easier. Then you're not saying it. He's telling his community, and the next and the next. So those things work. They really work, those small interventions, those leaky dams, those little swales, those little ditches, staggered ditches, whatever that they're doing. Oh, they work. They definitely work. And the combined effect of those actually does stop flooding in an area.
Yeah, so I guess in some communities you could kind of find some farmers or someone with large land a little bit higher up and convince them, and then once they succeed, then you can maybe
Yes.
spread to the other owners, like this is an approach to
Absolutely.
flooding.
Absolutely. That's what happened in Rajasthan as well. There was no getting permission to build johads on common land wasn't proving that easy. And one of the farmers who had a huge amount of land, he said, I'll give 15% of my land. It's already dry. Nothing is happening on it. So I might as well give 15% of it for the work to happen and let it benefit the community. I've got enough land, which is completely unproductive. But then when he did that, and the jahad was built, and the water was held, and the next time they had lots of water, suddenly, he was the hero. He was on various television programs. He was this, he was that. But it became a complete conversion that, people who had land started thinking, okay, I can do the same. So, so then it became a whole movement that not only people who had private land started doing it, but also, common land and the government officials, they are people in your own community. They too, they could see what a difference it made. So they started signing off on, you can build the johad on the common land to benefit X community. So it's what do you say? The proof of the pudding was in the actual seeing, but it took one courageous private farmer to do that. But if you can show the impact of it and have a real somebody who's willing to engage with that, that sets the tone very quickly.
So that's something could be for the viral social media, especially if someone, like, if there's a listener now, like maybe you could make some social media videos about, like, take these farmers or take a case study, because I think a personal story is very, it hits your emotional chords a bit better, right? And so make those stories and make those go viral, so
yeah. The work again and again and again, the work itself is the digging, etc., and creating the johad is the last 30%. The first 70% is social. It's the conversations, it's the getting everybody on board, or not even everybody, but getting people to trust each other that we can do this together. That's the 70% of the work, or 60, but the larger part of it.
Yeah, and I think one of the conversations, like, there's a huge conversation around the world around climate right now, and it's really focused on carbon and greenhouses. If there's a way to also bring in, like, that there's reasons these droughts and these floods and these fires that we're just attributing to the greenhouse gases, but it actually is attributed to land use change too. So yeah, I feel like that's a big, like, if we can get that vector diverted, some attention to this, then that should be a lot more people interested in this.
Absolutely. It's that one person who you might want to invite on your podcast, or even just interview him and edit, who really knows his stuff, who really has been hugely influential in us being able to put these ideas in place from a base of sound knowledge, is Mikhail Kravchik. He really is an amazingly well-informed, and what phenomenal work he's done in Slovakia. When we went to see Alpha, when the first I went to India, and every village I went to with Rajendra, and he was treated like God. Okay, almost. They were so thankful to, and not in a bad way, in a really heartfelt way, that with his work and his passion, he enthused them to do the work to bring their lives back to Slovakia. I saw something very similar in Slovakia. He helped so many villagers stop flooding by building those structures. And he really knows, they really know the people, the landscape. Mikhail is also a hydrologist, no? So he knows the numbers as well. He doesn't know, and he doesn't know those numbers in isolation. He knows those numbers in connection with the communities he's worked with. And that's very valuable. No, where you can bring the numbers and the people together, and then you can understand how much water is being lost from fresh water is being lost from the water cycle every year globally, and how many communities it'll take to do what. Some buildings, we should build a really social, viral thing with him. He's an amazing guy.
Right. And he did coin the term small water cycle, right? So
Yeah, I think it was him, yes.
yeah, so that's
I
become
had
a key concept.
enormous respect for these guys who, they got prizes, various fancy prizes, and yet they kept their feet on the ground because they know those prizes are a distraction. The real stuff is what communities can do. And they kept their energy and their passion with the communities and keeping the focus on what is real and seeing it happen more and more.
Right. In Slovakia, I think, were they going to build some huge dam? And he said, we can do it differently. We don't need to build a huge dam. We could do all these.
Yeah, that was one. That was the first,
smaller
the
dams.
800 villages were going to be flooded. But that was one. But the other was that, along those villages, he worked with the villagers to build these small structures, and then they built them and they didn't have any flooding anymore. So, and then of course the government over there is very different. They were communist government, then they were not communist, then they were communists. Then they believe in natural solutions, and then they don't. So there were many times they would threaten him as well that what you're doing isn't right, or they'd not listen to him and dismiss him or false accusations were put on him. But his villagers knew what he was doing, and that appreciation and understanding of a human being who really knows and helps them to come out of that problem that they're facing by enabling them to understand it. So he has that very high level understanding of global understanding, planetary understanding, not just local. And he's able to bring that down to the local. It's the same with regions. That's why I love these guys. They have a big vision, an understanding of the whole, and they are able to translate it to the small local. No? So they play a very, very valuable part. And then they enthuse you and excite you to do more. So and they're still here around. I mean, another one of my favorites who I often talk about, who is no more with us, is Zephaniah Firi. What an amazing man he was. Zephaniah Firi from Zimbabwe.
Uh-huh.
Oh, what an amazing man he must have been. He died in 2015, and I really feel sad not to have met him. But I see his legacy, and I see what a loyalty there is to what he enabled with his communities. So, and they exist, those kind of people exist in every country. So these are the ones I know, and there are a few others, but they exist. You have America, you have so many people like that. England, there are so many, they don't make it to mainstream news, but they are loved and they know the whole planetary. They are the ones who can solve the crisis, and yet, of course, because they're not sponsored by Coke or whatever those organizations are who hog the space. So they never make it to the mainstream.
Yeah, and like a lot more people should know about Kravchuk and Rajendra, and I actually don't know this person you said from Zimbabwe. What's the name again?
His name is Zephaniah Firi.
Zephaniah Firi, okay.
There is, what do you say? If you look him up, he's no longer there, but there is a wonderful film on him. The Water Harvester. Okay, there are two on him, the rainwater harvester and the water harvester. The water harvester. I'll send you the link. Then you have a look at that.
Yeah.
It's an amazing film. You look at it and you just think, this is what I want to do.
Right.
And that's why we started the Flow Partnership Alpha. That these are community heroes who understand the global planetary implications of what is happening down here, and yet they keep their feet on the ground. And that kind of work has to increase virally. That's what the Flow Partnership does.
Yeah, we need to kind of connect the on-the-ground work with like some of the intellectual understanding. Like Kravchuk has both, so that's why he's been very, very good. And I interviewed a hydroclimatologist on this podcast, Francina Dominguez. And when I was researching small water cycles, I came across a different term in the climate literature, that's called moisture recycling, and also
Oh,
and they're called moisture hopping when the moisture hops inland. And
yeah.
so they hadn't actually hadn't heard of small water cycle. Basically, moisture recycling is the same thing as the
Small water
that
cycle.
small water cycle. So I think those worlds need to be connected, because I know people in
Yeah.
academia, like Joe
Mm.
Brewer, he was in atmospheric science, but he got so frustrated it wasn't creating enough change. So he went to he's now in Colombia building projects on the ground with
Who's
water.
that? Who's that?
Joe Brewer.
Joe Brewer.
So he's restoring water stuff in Colombia. And but I feel like some of the reason, I mean, most of the climatology is focused more on different aspects, but there are a segment of climatologists that are focusing on the water cycle. And so that research needs to be, you know, brought out a lot more. And like Francina Dominguez, she did models where you look at the groundwater, it actually correlates with the rain, because the groundwater is being drawn up by the tree roots and mycelia, which then evapotranspire. So it's actually part of the small water cycle. And so that
small water cycle, hugely.
that there's a groundwater kind of rain cycle. And I was thinking we actually need to name it so that, you know, kind of like, so you make the small water cycle famous. Maybe there's a, I don't know, the high-low cycle or something, or the deep water cycle. But like there's really interesting research that these climatologists are doing, but like their work is not getting out, and that should be influencing. Because if we realize that part of the reason maybe we're getting droughts is because we're not replenishing groundwater, that's huge for government policy and for communities to know that. But no one's drawing that conclusion right now. Because we're depleting groundwater, that's affecting the rain, you know. So
I mean, even the carbon sequestration, there is so much of carbon sequestration in a healthy soil. There's so much of carbon sequestration in wetlands. So there's no, everybody talks carbon, 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 but actually it begins with water and the loss of the water from the small water cycle and the large water cycle. But the thing is that if all things were equal and we didn't have all this lobbying going on at those levels, then you would have a real debate. But there isn't a real debate happening. It's only what people are paid to spout. Even amongst your academics, they have terribly difficult lives. I mean, they have departments that they have to run for which they have to raise funds to keep going. So often the funds come with a little latch on the mouth. What do you do? So there are lots of closet scientists and academics who would love to be able to say what you are wanting them to say, what you've just said. So maybe, you know, and in the work that you've started in terms of the common words for water, bringing that common narrative, one common story around water right from the beginning when we've been talking, I think that could prove really valuable to bringing that that whole world into a simple, clear narrative that they can stand behind and not feel threatened. So I think that's really valuable, Alpha. There is so many different words for the same thing. Nature-based solution, natural retention features, runoff attenuation. The same thing is called by different scientists, different things. So if you have a common understanding which can become a gold standard in the world of this, then it would be much easier for people to get behind it, because the principle is common. Why do you call it 80 different names? In a different language, yes. But even in English, if you have 50 names for nature-based solutions. So I think what you're doing with water, what you're doing in terms of your 5 water stories or the water principles, all that, it's hard work. I know you've put in so much time and energy behind it, but it has begun to create, I think, a bit of thought. Yes, there is need for something which we can all stand behind. So I would say that would be something you must keep going with, because that will be incredibly valuable. You'll feel at times like it's just such a thankless task. It's like the way work we do it. It feels completely, you know, our whole goal is to keep it free. That this should be, why should knowledge around water revival be sold? It should be free. Communities should have it free. And then it's a thankless task, because you don't get the money. People don't give you the money for communities to be able to do it. So it's the same thing. You can keep going on and on and on and on, and then they'll turn around and tell you, you haven't understood it. You're not a scientist. You're not this. You're not that. Just keep going. And eventually the clouds will clear and something will come out. It takes a while,
Yeah.
but
Well,
it's really
here's
needed.
one catchy slogan that see what you think. Slow it, sink it, spread it, right?
Yeah.
So I was thinking also hop it, because there's that moisture hopping, which the climatologists, where it's basically a small water cycle. So the water goes inland through hopping from the land to the air to the land. So I said, slow it, sink it, spread it, hop it. So you're thinking of getting. That's why you have lack of rain further inland, because you're not hopping it inland. And then also lift it, because basically there's this thing called hydraulic lift, where the tree roots and the mycelia are lifting the water from the groundwater into, and then spreading it all around the soil. So I was thinking adding those two, hop it and lift it, to make people think, okay, we also got to, so
But
you're
you
kind of
can't
adding,
hop it.
sneaking in a small water cycle into the slow it, spread it, sink it meme.
So as you're talking, I'm thinking what you might like to do is actually have a word cloud. So
Mm-hmm.
you have these words coming out. And that would be very, because if you say hop it, first is very exciting. It hops, moisture hops. That's really exciting. That's
Mm-hmm.
a really good word. It makes it feel alive, no? But when you say hop it, I don't understand what I have to do in it. I mean, I understand, but in general, that's the question that comes. What do I have to do in it to make it hop it?
Right. So I guess slowing the water down will help hop it, because you're guiding it. You're absorbing the rainfall into the. Yeah, I guess it's a slightly different. It's not the verb that you actually do, but I
No,
guess to hop it, yeah, you have to absorb the rainfall into the soil. So
because
then
slowing I can
evapotranspire.
do, storing I can do, sinking I
Right.
can do, but
Yeah.
hopping it does by itself.
Yeah. If you do the
Okay,
first three, I guess.
yeah. So no. But a word cloud would enable that. Word clouds are really popular in England, especially nowadays because of this whole political stuff going on. So they have this Rishi Sunak's going to become PM, and then they send this word out and they create a word cloud. What people are saying of him. So there are 5 or 6 words come out about him: competent, rich, da 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 da. But if you have a word cloud with the main words like slow, store, sink, hop, lift, that would itself create a conversation around it with people thinking, okay, what do you mean hop? And then they can click on it and go and read about how moisture hops. I think you're on to a real winner there on Hop It. It is an exciting new introduction. You
Yeah, well,
don't
maybe
think
just
of moisture
hashtag hop
hopping.
it.
I know, isn't that cool? It is. It sort of makes you think, oh, it's fun.
Yeah,
It's
it's
not.
like a Francina Dominguez. I think she was studying the Midwest droughts, right? And she found out that the Midwest in that's in the middle of the U.S. was actually partly due to the water from California, and it wasn't hopping inland from California to the Midwest.
Uh-huh.
So we could say to the Midwest droughts, hop it,
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a really good words. So definitely, it creates a different buzz. Everybody's tired of slow store filter. So there's another part of the story that's hopping and lifting.
Yeah, I guess someone
Yeah.
added filter, right? Because I don't think Brock Dolman initially had filter, right? So someone added filter to it.
I think that was our scientists up in James Hutton, I think, because
Uh-huh.
when we did one of the first things, then they sent me the slow store filter was the thing, and then um, it got
Okay,
taken
cool.
up.
I think
It
Brock
got,
Dolman
yeah,
was the one who invented it, right? He's quite the wordsmith. He's always playing around with words, and he's
yeah,
here in
yeah,
California. He's a
yeah. No, he's
he's
a
a
good
word.
guy.
Yeah,
All these guys are, they all have different levels of skills. So can pull various of those skills together, which
right.
you're already doing actually. So not you are already doing that. So no, there is a good conversation happening in this space now, which is slowly uh, sort of creating an understanding of it is our responsibility. It's not alphas and minis and Brocks and Rajindras and Phillips and Mikhals. It is theirs and everybody else. No, we are just working to be able to shine a light on how to make it understandable in the day-to-day realm. The scientific articles, I think there is enough written across the world. There is enough evidence across. How much more evidence do we need?
We need to translate it so it's understandable and catchy so people know what to do about it.
Yes. So that's what we do with communities as well. That bridge between science and community. So science feels it's very, sometimes quite snobby about the figures that they have, but actually those figures are useless if they're not used by the community that lives on the land. And it's useful for scientists to figure out and crunch numbers around what the community wants to know. So that bridge is crucial, no? So if you're measuring something, measure what the community needs as well, not just giving them info, but getting info from them to inform you. And whenever we've done that, you find both sides, there is real excitement. So we did that with a project we did with Leicester University and IIT Kanpur in India with communities on a whole canal project. And then we did that with the engineers, civil engineers, really some of the best, most well-known civil engineers in the UK sitting with our communities on the Johad on top. And that discussion, so there is a meeting of hearts, not the disciplines. The disciplines come together in any case. So bringing the wisdom of both together is crucial. So it's not glorifying just the traditional or sitting only with the scientific. And that's the work we all are doing, I think.
Cool.
Uncovering, taking that curtain off from the mysterious snobbiness of science, or that, those communities, we can't talk to them, they're too far away. Bringing that we are all one on this planet, and the water cycle, large water cycle, is one. It connects us, and our small water cycles is what connects all of us to keep the earth healthy. So that's if we can do more and more of that, demystify it, then people will find it easier to take a step.
Right. So yeah, so this water movement is both a decentralized community movement and a kind of social media digital information movement and a kind of integration of scientific knowledge with indigenous ancient knowledge kind of.
Well put.
Kind of what, yeah.
Well put. And if we can do TikTok, if we can get the 15-year-olds really interested in the water cycle, imagine viral TikTok videos across China and Brazil and India and Japan and wherever. 16-year-olds interested. That's the age group that really, they are interested. It's just how do you get them to, how does it go viral in that sphere?
I mean, that's probably the most important age group because they have to live through all these problems for the rest of their lives, So
we can work on that. If we can figure out a way to make it viral in that age group, with that media, with that technology, what we're talking about today, you and I, would find a natural home for the future.
Cool. Thanks. Well, that's maybe a good place to end this conversation.
Yes. Thank you so much, Alpha. It's a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, thank you.